There's a story that's been told so many times in so many psychology textbooks that it's become almost a piece of common knowledge. A young woman is attacked outside her apartment building in the middle of the night. She screams for help. 38 of her neighbors hear her, watch from their windows, and do nothing. Nobody calls the police. Nobody comes outside. She dies alone in the very place where dozens of people could have saved her, simply because each one of them assumed somebody else would act. It's a genuinely chilling story, and it became one of the most famous case studies in the history of social psychology, giving rise to a term still used today, the bystander effect. The idea that the more people who witness someone in danger, the less likely any single one of them is to help, because responsibility quietly diffuses across the crowd. The trouble is, the story as it's usually told isn't quite what happened, and the real story, once you look closely at it, is in some ways more disturbing than the myth, not because it's more dramatic, but because it's more human, more complicated, and much harder to reduce to a single tidy lesson. Her name was Kitty Genovese. She was 28 years old, working as a bar manager in Queens, New York, well liked by the people who knew her, sharing an apartment with her partner, Mary Ann Zialonko. In the early morning hours of March 13th, 1964, she was walking from her car toward her apartment building after finishing a late shift at work. A man named Winston Mosley approached her with a knife. What followed was not a single, contained attack, but a prolonged, horrifying assault that unfolded in stages over roughly half an hour. Partly in the open, partly hidden, Mosley stabbed her. She screamed. At least one neighbor, a man named Robert Moser, shouted down from his window, telling the attacker to leave her alone. Mosley did retreat, apparently startled by the shout. This part is well documented and rarely disputed, but he returned a short while later and found Kitty again, badly wounded, in a hallway near the back of the building, where she tried to seek shelter, out of view from the street. There, out of sight of the street-facing windows that so much of the later reporting focused on, he assaulted her further and eventually killed her. The case might have remained a tragic, largely local story if not for what happened 2 weeks later, when a reporter for the New York Times, working with information from police sources, published an article that would go on to shape the case's legacy for decades. The headline read, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police." The article described a chillingly passive crowd, dozens of neighbors watching from the safety of their apartments, doing nothing while a young woman was murdered outside. That article is where the famous version of the story comes from. And it's the version that spread, first through news coverage, then through psychology textbooks, then through decades of retellings in classrooms and documentaries and, yes, videos exactly like this one. But in the decades since, journalists, researchers and legal investigators who went back to the original case files, trial transcripts and police records found a much messier, much less clean-cut picture than the one the Times had reported. This isn't a fringe revisionist claim, it's a conclusion supported by substantial follow-up reporting, including work done decades later by some of the same people connected to the original coverage. For one thing, the number 38 or 37 itself appears to have been imprecise from the start, more a dramatic round figure pulled together during early reporting than a carefully verified count of identified witnesses who clearly saw the entire attack and consciously chose to do nothing because of the layout of the buildings and the way the assault moved, partly on the street, partly around a corner, partly inside a hallway, out of view entirely. it's unlikely that any single witness saw the whole event from beginning to end. Most people who did notice something reported hearing only fragments, a scream, a scuffle, sounds that in the middle of the night from a distance are genuinely difficult to interpret as an ongoing murder rather than, say, a drunken argument or a domestic dispute spilling into the street, which was apparently how several witnesses described their impression at the time. It also turned out that at least a couple of calls to the police were made during the incident, contradicting the framing that literally nobody tried to get help. One neighbor, Sophia Farrar, went further than simply calling. She left her apartment and went to Kitty directly, cradling her in the hallway while they waited for help to arrive after the attack. That detail rarely made it into the popular retelling at all, because it complicates the clean narrative of total, uniform bystander apathy. None of this means the original story was invented out of thin air, or that this was some heroic, well-handled emergency response. Real people did hear real signs of distress that night and did not act on them in ways that, with hindsight, feel agonizing. Some genuinely assumed it was a lover's quarrel and didn't want to get involved in what they thought was somebody else's private business. Some heard something, weren't sure what it was, and went back to sleep. The layout of the buildings meant that even people who wanted to help may not have had a clear, immediate way to understand what was happening or where. It's a story with real failures of action in it. It's just not the story of 38 calculating, indifferent witnesses calmly watching a murder unfold in full view and choosing, one after another, to do nothing. What's genuinely strange and worth sitting with is that the myth, the exaggerated, oversimplified version, ended up producing something real and valuable anyway. In the years immediately following the Times article, two social psychologists, John Darley and Bibb Latané, became interested in the case, and specifically in the psychological phenomenon the story seemed to illustrate. They wanted to understand empirically whether the presence of other people really could make an individual less likely to help someone in an emergency. Their experiments, conducted in laboratory settings rather than city streets, tested this directly. In one well-known version, participants believed they were part of a group discussion happening over an intercom system, when one of the other participants, actually a recording, appeared to have a seizure and called for help. Darley and Latané varied how many other people each participant believed were also listening in. What they found was strikingly consistent. Participants who believed they were the only other person listening intervened quickly, nearly every time. But as the perceived number of other witnesses increased, the likelihood that any individual participant would help, and the speed at which they did so, dropped significantly. This became known as the bystander effect, and the specific mechanism behind it, diffusion of responsibility, has been replicated across a substantial body of research since. When we believe others are equally capable of acting, each of us tends to feel slightly less personally responsible for stepping in ourselves, not out of malice or coldness, but through a kind of quiet, largely unconscious recalculation of who's supposed to act. So there's a strange, layered irony sitting at the center of this whole story. Kitty Genovese's actual death did not unfold the way the famous account claims, but the fictionalized, oversimplified version of her death directly inspired a genuine, well-documented body of psychological research that has gone on to shape our understanding of real emergency situations, from CPR training to workplace safety protocols to public health campaigns about intervening when you witness harassment or abuse. The myth, in other words, produced real, useful science, even though the myth itself deserved a much more careful retelling than it originally received. This raises an uncomfortable question worth asking directly rather than skating past. Does it matter that so much valuable research grew out of a story that wasn't accurately reported? In one sense, no. The underlying psychological phenomenon the Genovese case supposedly illustrated turned out to be real and measurable, verified independently through careful experimentation. Regardless of whether the original news story that inspired the research got the specific facts right, diffusion of responsibility isn't disproven just because the story that led researchers to investigate it was exaggerated. But in another sense, it matters quite a bit, because for decades, an entire community's reputation was shaped by an inaccurate story. The idea that 38 callous New Yorkers watched a murder and shrugged became a kind of cultural shorthand for urban alienation and moral indifference. Repeated so often, it became accepted as settled historical fact, when the reality was a group of people, most of whom heard only confusing partial fragments of an event happening mostly out of their sightline, who responded with the same uneven mix of concern, confusion, hesitation, and occasional real courage that probably describes how most of us would respond in a similarly unclear, frightening situation in the middle of the night. Kitty Genovese herself, in a way, got lost inside her own story for decades, reduced from a real 28-year-old woman with a job, a partner, and a life, into a symbol, a case study, a cautionary tale about crowds and apathy. It's taken a great deal of careful, deliberate work by journalists and by her own family, including her brother, Bill Genovese, who spent years investigating the case and eventually released a documentary revisiting what actually happened that night to pull her back out from underneath the myth and into focus as an actual person, rather than simply the name attached to a psychological phenomenon. There's something worth carrying away from this that goes beyond the specific mechanics of diffusion of responsibility. It's a reminder about how easily a true tragic event can be simplified into something cleaner and more dramatic than reality, especially when the simplified version serves a satisfying narrative, in this case, a story about the moral failure of an indifferent, uncaring city. And it's a reminder that even after a story like that gets corrected decades later in the historical record, the original inaccurate version often keeps circulating anyway, because it's simpler to tell, and because by the time the correction arrives, the myth has already done its cultural work. The real story of what happened to Kitty Genovese doesn't offer the same clean, damning lesson as the myth did. It's messier. Some people acted, some people hesitated, some people misunderstood what they were hearing entirely. That's a much less satisfying story to tell than 38 people watched and did nothing. But it might be a more useful one, precisely because it's closer to how emergencies actually unfold in real life, not as a single obvious moment where anyone would clearly know to act, but as a confusing, partial, ambiguous set of signals that reasonable people can misread, hesitate over, or simply fail to piece together in time. Maybe that's the part of this story worth holding on to longest. Not the number of witnesses, and not even the psychological principle it accidentally helped prove, but the reminder that the line between a bystander and someone who helps often isn't about who's a good person and who isn't. It's about whether, in a confusing and frightening moment, we let the presence of other people quietly convince us that our own action isn't the one that's needed. Kitty Genovese's death didn't happen the way most of us were taught it did, but the uncomfortable truth underneath the myth that we are all a little too willing to assume somebody else will step forward first turned out to be real after all,